The 7% lie that's been holding you back. Here's something nobody tells you in school, in your first job, or at the dinner table growing up. The most powerful people in every room, the executives who close 8-figure deals, the leaders who inspire entire organizations to move mountains, the negotiators who walk into impossible situations and somehow come out ahead. They're not playing the game you think they're playing. You've been told that success comes from working harder, being smarter, having the right degree, the right resume, the right connections. And while all of that matters, none of it matters as much as this: how you communicate, not what you say, how you say it. Researchers at UCLA published a landmark study showing that the actual words we use account for roughly 7% of how we're perceived. 7%. The other 93% comes from tone, body language, pacing, presence, the invisible architecture of how you show up in a room. That means you could have the most brilliant idea in the history of your industry, and if you're delivering it with slumped shoulders, a cracking voice, and nervous filler words, people will walk away unimpressed. Not because your idea was bad, because you communicated it like someone who didn't believe in it. But here's the flip side. You could say something fairly ordinary, a simple observation, a straightforward question, a well-timed pause, and if you deliver it with the right presence, the right energy, the right psychological timing, people will lean in. They'll remember it. They'll tell others about it. This is the dirty secret of influence. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. I've spent years studying what separates the communicators who command rooms from those who blend into the wallpaper. I've analyzed speeches, studied negotiations, observed boardroom dynamics, and dissected the habits of people who seem to effortlessly win over anyone they meet. What I found wasn't magic, it wasn't natural, talent. It wasn't charisma that some people are lucky enough to be born with. It was a system, a learnable, repeatable, scientifically grounded system of behaviors, language patterns, psychological triggers, and physical habits that anyone, regardless of background, personality type, or past communication history, can develop. That system is what this book is about. You'll learn how to walk into any room and immediately signal competence and confidence before you say a single word, how to structure your thoughts so people can't look away, how to use silence as a weapon, how to navigate conflict without losing either the argument or the relationship, how to build the kind of presence that makes people want to follow you, work with you, and believe in you. This isn't theoretical. Every technique in these pages has been tested in real American boardrooms, real negotiations, real job interviews, real difficult conversations. From Silicon Valley pitch meetings to Chicago courtrooms, from Nashville boardrooms to New York living rooms, where a single conversation changed everything. The psychology of communication is universal, and once you master it, you will never again struggle to be heard, respected, or taken seriously. One warning before we begin: this only works if you use it. Reading is the beginning, not the end. Each chapter closes with techniques you can deploy in your very next conversation. The gap between people who understand communication and people who own their communication is simply practice. Let's begin. 7 Silent Killers, the communication mistakes that destroy your credibility before you speak. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine 2 people walking into the same job interview at the same Fortune 500 company in Dallas. Both have impressive resumes. Both are technically qualified. Both want the job badly. The first walks in and immediately starts with, "I hope I'm not taking up too much of your time." When asked about her strengths, she says, "Well, I think I'm probably good at." When the interviewer challenges one of her ideas, she immediately backs down. "Oh, you're right, yeah, that might not work." The second walks in, makes direct eye contact, and says, "I've been looking forward to this conversation." When asked about her strengths, she gives one clear, specific example. When challenged, she listens, nods, and says, "That's a fair point. Here's how I've seen that handled successfully." Both women have identical qualifications. Both answered every question. But one of them got the job, and it wasn't close. What happened? The first woman committed what I call the 7 silent killers, the communication mistakes that destroy your influence before you've said anything meaningful. These mistakes are so common that roughly 95% of Americans make at least 3 of them on a daily basis, and most of them have no idea. Let's expose them one by one. Silent killer. Number 1, reactive communication. Reactive communicators never lead. They wait. They wait for someone else to start the conversation. Wait to see what tone the other person sets. Wait to see which direction the discussion goes before deciding where they stand. This is devastating to your influence because the human brain is hardwired to assign leadership status to whoever controls the direction of a conversation. When you're constantly responding instead of initiating, you're unconsciously training every person you interact with to see you as a follower, regardless of your title, your expertise, or your actual authority. The telltale signs of reactive communication include apologizing before sharing an opinion, asking permission to speak, using heavily hedged language like, "I might be wrong, but," or "I'm not sure if this makes sense," and constantly checking others' faces for signs of approval before finishing a thought. The fix isn't aggression, it's intentionality. Lead the first sentence. Set the first frame. The person who speaks with direction is the person who gets followed. Silent killer. Number 2, information flooding. Most Americans grew up being told that being smart means having all the answers. So we demonstrate our intelligence by sharing everything we know, every data point, every caveat, every supporting detail. This is one of the most common ways brilliant people get ignored. Here's what the neuroscience tells us. The human brain doesn't process information rationally. It processes it emotionally. And when you flood someone with data, their brain doesn't think, "Wow, this person is thorough." It thinks, "I'm overwhelmed, I'm shutting down." Cognitive scientists call this decision fatigue. The more information you throw at someone, the less capable they become of agreeing with you. Paradoxically, the person who shares 3 perfectly chosen points is almost always more persuasive than the person who shares 17. Steve Jobs was famously obsessed with this principle. When Apple's marketing teams would bring him decks with dozens of product features to highlight, he would strip them down relentlessly until only the 1 or 2 most compelling ideas remained. His rule: if everything is important, nothing is. The most powerful communicators are editors, not encyclopedias. Silent killer number 3, emotional leakage. You've seen this happen. Someone walks into a presentation and says all the right things, but something feels off. There's a slight tremor in their voice. Their eyes dart around the room. Their words say confident, but everything else says terrified. That's emotional leakage, and it's brutally effective at destroying credibility. Emotional leakage happens when your internal emotional state bleeds out through the cracks of your communication, through micro-expressions, vocal tension, involuntary physical movements, and subtle changes in pace and pitch that your audience reads before they've consciously processed a single word you've said. The problem isn't that you feel nervous, anxious, or uncertain. Everyone does. The problem is the gap between what you say and what you broadcast. Here's the insight most communication coaches miss. You can't outact emotional leakage. Trying to fake confidence while feeling terrified is like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. The pressure eventually wins. What you actually need is genuine emotional regulation, not suppression, regulation. We'll come back to this extensively in Chapter 7. For now, simply notice, are your words and your body telling the same story? Silent killer number 4, the mirror trap. Some people are so desperate to be liked that they become a reflection of whoever they're talking to. They adopt the other person's energy, echo their opinions, adjust their personality, their vocabulary, even their posture to match the person across from them. They think this makes them more relatable. What it actually makes them is invisible. Here's the psychological reality. People don't trust mirrors. We trust presence. We trust people who have a distinct perspective, a recognizable voice, a clear point of view. When you mirror everyone you meet, you stop being a person and start being an echo. And nobody takes echoes seriously. The mirror trap is especially common among high achievers who've succeeded by being adaptable. The skill that got you far in certain environments becomes a liability in leadership situations where people need to know. Who are you? What do you actually stand for? Silent killer number 5. Defensive posturing. Someone asks a neutral question about your project. You answer it, but you also explain why the situation isn't your fault, why the timeline was difficult, why the circumstances were unusual. Nobody asked for that, but you offered it anyway. This is defensive posturing. The communication habit of treating ordinary conversations like legal depositions, where you're always one question away from being blamed for something. Defensive communicators exhaust people. They turn casual check-ins into conflicts, feedback into attacks, and discussions into debates. Over time, their colleagues learn to simply stop raising issues with them. Not because everything is fine, but because the cost of a conversation isn't worth the emotional labor. And the brutal irony? Defensive communication doesn't protect your credibility. It destroys it. Every time you rush to explain yourself before anyone has accused you of anything, you signal that you know there's something worth defending. Confident people don't defend unprovoked. They simply respond. Silent killer number 6. Approval hunger. There's a version of this that most people don't recognize in themselves because it looks like niceness. Approval-hungry communicators soften every strong statement. They laugh self-deprecatingly when nobody asked them to. They end declarative sentences with rising inflection, turning every point into a question. The deadline should be Friday? And we might want to loop in the whole team? They prioritize being liked over being clear. The problem is that people don't trust those who seek their approval. They respect those who don't need it. When your communication is shaped by the question, will they like this? Instead of, is this true and useful? People sense it immediately, and they stop relying on you for anything important. Silent killer number 7. Communicating on autopilot. Most people have never once in their lives studied communication. They've just done it. Absorbed patterns from their parents, their schools, their cultural environment, and repeated those patterns on autopilot for decades, including the destructive ones. Autopilot communicators blame external circumstances when interactions go wrong. They just didn't understand me. The room wasn't receptive. She's always like that. They never look inward because they don't have a framework for what good communication actually looks like. This book is the framework. But frameworks only work when you use them with intention. Every conversation you have from this point forward is a data point. Every interaction is feedback. The communicator who pays attention learns more in 1 month than the autopilot communicator learns in a decade. The 3-second window. what neuroscience says about the judgments that stick. In 2006, Princeton psychologists Alexander Todorov and Janine Willis published a study that changed how researchers think about first impressions. Their finding: people make reliable judgments about a stranger's competence, trustworthiness, and dominance within 100 milliseconds of seeing their face. Not 3 seconds, 1/10 of a second. And the judgments formed in those 100 milliseconds, they correlate heavily with judgments formed after unlimited observation time. In other words, snap decisions are remarkably accurate and remarkably resistant to revision. This is both alarming and empowering. Alarming because you're being assessed constantly, quickly, and largely below the level of conscious awareness. Empowering because once you understand the signals that trigger positive first impressions, you can generate them deliberately. The brain's first impression system evolved as a survival mechanism. For most of human history, quickly assessing whether a stranger was threat or ally, dominant or submissive, trustworthy or deceptive, was a matter of life and death. That ancient circuitry hasn't been updated for the modern world. It still operates the same way in a boardroom that it did on the savannah. What does the brain look for? Researchers have identified 5 primary channels through which first impressions form. Channel 1. Physical presence, before words. Before your mouth opens, your body has already been broadcasting for several seconds. Confident physical presence has a specific signature that the brain recognizes instantly. It includes upright spinal alignment, not rigid, but elongated, as if a string is gently pulling you from the crown of your head, shoulders relaxed but back, weight evenly distributed, movement that is deliberate rather than reactive. This isn't vanity, it's neuroscience. Research from Harvard Business School's Amy Cuddy and her colleagues shows that body posture doesn't just communicate confidence, it generates it. The relationship between physical state and emotional state runs in both directions. Think about the last person who walked into a room and immediately owned it. They probably didn't rush. They didn't hunch. They moved like they had arrived somewhere they belonged because their body believed it, and so their brain performed accordingly. Pay attention to how you enter spaces. The walk from the door to the table in a conference room. The moment you step onto a stage. The way you approach someone at a networking event. These transitions are being watched and assessed before you arrive. Channel 2. The eyes have it. Eye contact is one of the most nuanced and powerful elements of first impression management. Too little, and you signal evasion, insecurity, or disinterest. Too much, and you trigger the primate aggression response, the feeling that someone is trying to dominate or challenge you. The sweet spot? Research suggests eye contact lasting 3 to 5 seconds during speaking and 4 to 6 seconds during listening creates the ideal combination of engagement and respect. But here's what most communication books miss. It's not just duration, it's quality. Confident eye contact is warm, not hard. There's a difference between looking at someone because you find them genuinely interesting and staring at someone to prove you're not intimidated. People feel the difference immediately. When meeting someone for the first time, make your first moment of eye contact intentional and complete. A glance doesn't register. A genuine, warm look that says, "I see you and I'm glad to be here," sets the entire tone of what follows. Channel 3. Your voice is a broadcast tower. Every time you open your mouth, your voice is transmitting data on multiple frequencies simultaneously. It's carrying your words, that's 7%. But it's also carrying your emotional state, your confidence level, your energy, your level of preparation, and your unconscious beliefs about whether you deserve to be heard. Most Americans speak at an average pace of about 130 to 150 words per minute. Confident communicators deliberately slow this down in high-stakes moments to around 110 words per minute. The slower pace signals that the speaker believes their words are worth the listener's time, and that belief is contagious. Vocal authority also depends on breath support. Shallow breathing, the kind that happens when you're nervous, produces a thin, slightly strained sound that the brain registers as uncertainty. Deep diaphragmatic breathing produces a full, warm, resonant tone that the brain registers as calm and capable. One of the most common credibility killers in American professional culture is upspeak, the habit of ending declarative sentences with rising inflection as if everything you say is a question. So I reviewed the numbers, and I think we should move forward. This pattern, borrowed from casual conversation, is devastating in professional settings because it signals that you're seeking permission for your own opinions. Statements should sound like statements. Channel 4. Your opening words. Set the frame. Due to something psychologists call the primacy effect, people remember and weight the first thing they hear from you disproportionately. Your opening words aren't just an introduction. They're a frame that colors everything that follows. Weak openings immediately lower your perceived status. These include apologizing for your presence, sorry to take up your time, excessive hedging, this might not be the right approach, and hollow small talk that signals you're filling space because you don't know how to lead a conversation. Strong openings are specific, purposeful, and confident. They don't require you to be aggressive or dramatic. They simply demonstrate that you came with intention. I wanted to share something I've been thinking about since our last conversation. I've got a question that's been on my mind. Do you have a few minutes? These openings communicate competence before a single substantive idea has been shared. Lead the frame from the first sentence. Channel 5. Congruence, the lie detector. Human beings are extraordinarily sensitive to incongruence between communication channels. When your words say one thing and your body says another, your audience experiences a subtle but powerful signal: something is off. They may not be able to articulate what, but the discomfort registers immediately, and it damages trust. This is why emotional congruence, the alignment between your genuine internal state and your outward communication, is so much more powerful than any surface-level technique. You can't reliably fake confident body language while feeling terrified, because the micro-expressions, vocal micro-tensions, and subtle postural cues leak the truth faster than you can consciously manage them. The most powerful first impression you can create is one where your words, body, voice, and energy all tell the same story. That alignment is what people experience as presence, and it's what makes certain individuals feel magnetic the moment they walk into a room. The authority matrix, how real power actually works. Here's a common misconception that keeps smart people stuck. They believe authority is something you claim by being the loudest voice in the room, the most insistent, the most dominant. They've watched certain leaders, aggressive, interruptive, forceful, and concluded that's what power looks like. They're wrong, and that mistake costs them more influence than almost anything else. Real authority doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. Think about the most genuinely powerful people you've encountered in your life. Not the most aggressive, the most genuinely respected. Was their authority based on volume? On forcing their way through conversations? Or was it something quieter? A calm certainty. A sense that this person had thought carefully about things, that they could handle pressure without coming apart, that their word meant something. That's what authority actually looks like. And it's built through 7 specific elements. Element 1, emotional regulation as power. In American culture, we often unconsciously respect displays of passion and intensity, but the people who actually get promoted, trusted with responsibility, and given authority are consistently the ones who can stay cool when everyone else is running hot. When a project goes sideways and the room starts spiraling, the person who takes a breath and says, "Okay, here's what we know and here's what we need to figure out," instantly becomes the de facto leader, regardless of their title. Because leadership at its most fundamental level is the ability to regulate the emotional temperature of a situation. This doesn't mean being robotic. Authoritative people feel things deeply. They're simply skilled at processing emotions before those emotions control their communication. The response comes from intention, not reaction. And here's the powerful part. Emotional regulation is contagious. When you remain steady, the people around you become steadier. Your calm gives others permission to think clearly. That's not a soft skill. That's leadership. Element 2. Intellectual confidence. There's a crucial distinction between intellectual confidence and arrogance that most people never articulate clearly. Arrogant people believe they already know everything worth knowing. They interrupt because they've already decided what you're about to say. They dismiss new information because it threatens the coherence of their existing worldview. Intellectually confident people are completely different. They've done serious thinking on the things they care about, and they hold those positions firmly. But they also know what they don't know, and they're genuinely interested in updating their understanding when better information arrives. This combination, clear positions held firmly but not rigidly, is one of the most attractive qualities a communicator can develop. It projects both strength and intellectual integrity. You know where this person stands, and you know they're telling you what they actually think. In contrast, the person who immediately folds the moment anyone pushes back signals that they were never really committed to their position in the first place. This isn't open-mindedness. It's the absence of conviction, and people sense it as weakness. Element 3. Purposeful communication. Authoritative communicators have a quality that immediately sets them apart from the crowd. They don't speak to fill space. When they have something to say it clearly and completely. When they don't, they stay quiet, comfortable with the silence, uncompelled to narrate their own uncertainty or perform engagement they don't feel. This purposefulness creates a powerful dynamic over time. The people around them learn to pay attention when they speak, because when they speak, it counts. Their contributions carry weight precisely because they're not diluted by filler. Compare this to the person who comments on everything, qualifies every statement, and offers running commentary throughout every meeting. After enough exposure, their voice becomes background noise, not because their ideas are bad, but because there are too many of them, poorly selected, poorly filtered. Speak less, mean more. Element 4. Boundaries as self-respect. One of the most powerful ways to establish authority is also one of the most misunderstood, setting clear, consistent limits on how you'll be treated. Many people confuse boundaries with aggression, but boundaries are not aggressive, they're self-respecting. They communicate a simple message: I take myself seriously, which means I expect you to as well. The most effective boundaries aren't delivered dramatically. They don't require raised voices or confrontational speeches. They're communicated calmly, specifically, and without apology, and then enforced consistently regardless of whether the other person likes it. A senior attorney in Chicago once told me something I've never forgotten. She said, "The moment I stopped explaining why I needed respect and just started expecting it, everything changed. People follow the lead you give them. Your limits communicate your self-image, and people treat you the way you teach them to." Element 5. Competence as foundation. All the communication techniques in the world are built on a single bedrock that cannot be faked indefinitely, actually being good at what you do. Authority rooted in genuine capability is qualitatively different from authority performed through technique. It's more stable, more resilient under pressure, and more resistant to being undermined. You can feel the difference between someone who knows what they're talking about and someone who has learned to sound like they know. And most people you're trying to impress have enough experience to feel it too. This doesn't mean you need to be a world-class expert before communicating with confidence. It means there's no sustainable shortcut to putting in the work to develop real knowledge and real skill in your domain. The good news: genuine competence compounds. The more you build, the more confident you naturally become, and the more confident you naturally communicate. Element 6. Strategic. Vulnerability. This one surprises people. Real authority isn't the absence of doubt or limitation. Real authority is being honest about those things, selectively, strategically, in ways that serve the conversation and the relationship. When a leader says, "I don't have a good answer for that yet. Let me think on it and get back to you," that's not weakness, that's integrity. And integrity is one of the rarest and most powerful forms of authority. The key distinction is between emotional dumping, sharing every doubt and fear regardless of context, and strategic vulnerability, acknowledging specific limitations in ways that build trust and focus the conversation on solutions. The first drains the room. The second earns it. Element 7. Social intelligence. The seventh element of real authority is often the hardest to develop because it requires the most self-awareness, the ability to read a room, understand the unspoken dynamics at play, and adjust your approach accordingly, without losing your authentic voice. A woman who communicates with genuine authority in a Silicon Valley product meeting carries that same authority into a difficult conversation with her teenage son and a tense negotiation with a difficult landlord. Not because she uses the same words and the same style in all three. She doesn't. But because her underlying confidence, competence, and clarity are consistent across contexts. Authoritative people are not uniform. They're coherent. They understand which aspects of their communication to modulate and which to hold constant. They read social cues quickly, adjust their register intelligently, and still sound unmistakably like themselves. This is social intelligence. And it's the final piece of the authority matrix that holds everything else together. The Persuasion Operating System: How to Change Minds Without Force. In 1972, a young insurance salesman named Frank Betker sat across from a wealthy physician in a Philadelphia office and made what should have been an easy sale. Frank had the numbers. He had the logic. He had a product that genuinely made sense for this man's financial situation. He laid out every piece of evidence, answered every objection, and by the end of the conversation, he had presented what he privately believed was an airtight case. The doctor thanked him warmly and said he'd think about it. He never called back. Frank spent 3 days replaying that meeting before he finally understood what had gone wrong. He had answered every question the doctor asked, but he had never addressed the one the doctor hadn't asked. Buried beneath the polite conversation was a single unspoken concern. Will my family be okay if something happens to me? Frank had been selling logic to a man who was making an emotional decision. Once he understood that, everything changed. He went back. He didn't bring new data. He told a story about a family he knew, a man about the doctor's age who had put off exactly this decision for exactly the same reasons, and about what happened to his wife and 3 children when he died unexpectedly the following spring. The doctor signed before Frank finished the second paragraph. That story illustrates the single most important insight in all of human persuasion. People don't make decisions with their logic and then justify them with their emotions. They make decisions with their emotions and then justify them with their logic. This is not a criticism of human nature. It's how we're wired. The limbic system, the emotional brain, processes information and generates responses faster than the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thought, can even engage. By the time you think you're thinking clearly, your emotional brain has already voted. Understanding this changes everything about how you communicate when you need to move someone, not manipulate them, not coerce them, but genuinely move them toward a decision they'll feel good about. Here is the persuasion operating system that actually works. Principle 1. Find the real motivation. Before you attempt to persuade anyone of anything, you need to answer one question accurately. What does this person actually care about? Not what they say they care about. Not what you think they should care about. What they actually care about, at the level where decisions get made. People are motivated by a surprisingly consistent set of core drivers: security, recognition, freedom, connection, growth, legacy, and the desire to avoid pain or embarrassment. Any of these can be the dominant force in a given decision, and if you're appealing to the wrong one, your most brilliant argument will fall completely flat. A marketing director at a Chicago tech company told me about the time she needed to convince her CEO to invest in a new content strategy. She went in with ROI projections, conversion rate analyses, and competitive benchmarking. He said he'd look it over. 3 weeks passed. Nothing. She went back, but this time she'd done her homework. She knew the CEO's real driver wasn't revenue. It was legacy. He wanted to build something that would outlast him. So she reframed the entire proposal around brand positioning, industry reputation, and the kind of long-term authority that competitors couldn't buy their way into. He approved it the same afternoon. Same data, different frame. The difference was understanding what actually moved him. Principle 2. Build real rapport. There is a version of rapport building that every negotiation seminar in America has taught for 30 years, and it doesn't work the way people think it does. It involves mirroring body language, using someone's name repeatedly, finding superficial common ground, and deploying active listening signals. The nods, the mm-hms, the tilted head. Done mechanically, this is immediately transparent, and people find it off-putting in the exact way that being clearly sold to is off-putting. Real rapport is not a technique, it's an orientation. It means walking into a conversation genuinely curious about the other person, asking questions you actually want answered, listening not to form your next response, but to actually understand what they're telling you. Caring, even slightly, about whether the outcome of this conversation serves their real interests. When you operate from that orientation, you don't need techniques. The rapport builds itself, and it holds, not just for the duration of this conversation, but across weeks and months and years of repeated interaction. That durability is what creates the kind of trust where real influence lives. Principle 3. Tell stories, not arguments. In 2010, Uri Hassan at Princeton published research demonstrating that when a speaker tells a compelling story, the brain of the listener begins to synchronize with the brain of the speaker. Not metaphorically, literally. Activity in the listener's neural networks begins to mirror the speaker's ear, phenomenon Hassan called neural coupling. Arguments trigger the brain's defense mechanisms. Stories slip past them. When you make an argument, you're asking someone's prefrontal cortex to evaluate your reasoning and decide whether to accept it. This process is inherently adversarial. The brain is looking for ways to poke holes. When you tell a story, You're taking someone on a journey. Their brain is no longer evaluating your logic, it's living the experience with you. The character's fear becomes their fear. The character's relief becomes their relief. By the time you land on your insight or conclusion, it doesn't feel like persuasion. It feels like discovery. The best stories for persuasion share certain qualities. They feature someone the listener can recognize in themselves. They include specific sensory detail that makes the scene feel real rather than hypothetical. They show a genuine problem, not a sanitized version of one, and a resolution that your idea, your proposal, or your recommendation made possible. You don't need to be a novelist to tell a persuasive story. You need one good, true example. Lead with the person, not the lesson. Make it specific enough to feel real. Let the insight arrive at the end. Principle 4. Address the resistance before it speaks. Every person listening to a proposal has objections forming in their head. The novice persuader waits for those objections to surface and then tries to defeat them. The master persuader addresses them before they're voiced. This does something powerful psychologically. It signals that you've thought seriously about the other person's perspective, that you understand their concerns and have genuinely wrestled with them. It also removes the adversarial dynamic because now there are no objections to raise. You've already put them on the table yourself. You might be wondering whether this timeline is realistic given everything else on your plate. And honestly, that was my first concern too. Here's what I've done to account for it. That single sentence disarms more resistance than an hour of counter-argument ever could. Principle 5. Create real urgency. The human brain is wired to defer decisions. The default answer to any proposal is not yet, because deciding requires cognitive energy, and deferring conserves it. Effective persuasion includes a genuine reason why acting sooner serves the other person's interests better than waiting. The critical word is genuine. Americans have been so thoroughly conditioned to recognize manufactured urgency, the fake countdown timers, the artificial scarcity, the "this offer expires at midnight" theater, that false urgency now actively backfires. The moment people sense they're being manipulated into a decision, you lose not just the sale, but the relationship. Real urgency looks different. It's the cost of delay. Every week we wait on this, we're leaving $40,000 on the table. It's a genuine window. This team has an opening for the next 3 weeks. After that, they're committed through Q3. It's the opportunity cost. This is the moment when the market is positioned for this. 6 months from now, the window will have closed. Help people see what waiting actually costs them. That's legitimate urgency. And it works. Principle 6. Remove the friction. Motivation is not enough. People will talk themselves out of decisions they genuinely want to make if the path forward feels complicated, risky, or overwhelming. The job of the final stage of persuasion is to remove every barrier between wanting to say yes and actually saying yes. Break large commitments into smaller initial steps. Offer a trial, a pilot, a test run that reduces perceived risk. Handle the administrative details yourself. Give them a single, clear next action rather than a menu of possibilities. The fewer decisions they have to make to move forward, the more likely they are to move forward. This isn't manipulation. It's service. You're making it easy for them to do something they already want to do. Principle 7. Lock in the next step. More persuasion attempts fail at this point than at any other. The conversation goes well. There's genuine agreement. Both people feel good. And then you shake hands and walk away without a specific, concrete commitment about what happens next. And by Thursday of the following week, the entire thing has evaporated. This happens not because people are duplicitous, It happens because life is busy, inertia is powerful, and without a specific next action, there's no momentum to sustain. Before you leave any persuasion conversation, confirm. What exactly are we agreeing to? Who is doing what? By when? When do we check back in? The goal isn't to trap people in commitments they didn't intend to make. It's to honor the agreement you both just reached by giving it a real structure that keeps it alive until it becomes a reality. The discipline of silence, what you don't say, is half the message. There's a scene that plays out constantly in American boardrooms and living rooms and first dates and job interviews. Someone asks a question. The other person opens their mouth before the question has finished landing, sometimes before it's even fully asked. Words pour out in a rush, slightly unorganized, slightly over-explained. The answer goes 30 seconds too long. And somewhere in the middle of it, the person listening stops really listening and starts waiting for their turn. The speaker walks away feeling like they communicated. The listener walks away with almost nothing retained. Now, contrast that with something you've almost certainly experienced. A conversation with someone who listened completely, paused thoughtfully, and then said something that landed like it had been precisely calibrated for that exact moment. You probably remember that conversation. You might remember it for years. The difference wasn't intelligence or vocabulary or charm. It was silence. Strategic, deliberate, confident silence. The most underused communication tool in the American professional arsenal. Most people treat silence as failure, a gap in the conversation to be anxiously filled, a signal that something has gone wrong. Skilled communicators treat it as an instrument. The confidence pause. The simplest form of strategic silence is the pause before you speak. Not a hesitation, not a fumble, a deliberate, unhurried beat that communicates something important. I'm choosing my words rather than just releasing them. This pause does 3 things simultaneously. It gives you time to organize your thought so what comes out is cleaner and more precise. It creates anticipation in the listener, a micro moment of what is this person about to say that sharpens attention, and it signals a quality of thoughtfulness that immediately elevates your perceived competence. In American culture especially, we've been conditioned to associate speed with intelligence. Quick responses feel sharp, delayed ones feel slow. But this is backwards in high-stakes conversations. In a salary negotiation, a strategic pause after the initial offer is more powerful than any counter-argument. In a difficult conversation with a family member, a pause before responding to a provocative statement prevents escalation and signals emotional maturity. Practice the confidence pause in low-stakes situations first. In casual conversations, when you'd normally jump right in, notice how it feels. Notice how others respond. The emphasis pause. Once you've made an important point, stop talking. Seriously, stop. Give the point space to breathe. Most people rush from thought to thought as though continuous speech is proof of preparation. But rapid-fire delivery actually reduces retention. The brain needs micro moments of quiet to process and consolidate new information. When you don't give it those moments, information streams past without anchoring. The emphasis pause is simply a conscious silence after your most important sentences. It says to the listener, without words, that mattered. Take a moment with it. Watch great speakers, not the loud ones, the good ones, and notice how they wield these pauses. They're not dead air. They're punctuation marks that tell the audience where the meaning is. The invitation pause. This is the pause that creates space for someone else to enter the conversation more fully than they otherwise would have. Most people talk until they're done, then ask a polite question and wait briefly before talking again. This rhythm is comfortable and socially normal, and it produces shallow exchanges. The invitation pause is different. It's a silence you hold after asking a question, making room for the other person not just to answer, but to reveal. You're not filling the space while they organize their thoughts. You're giving them that space, and the implicit message that what they're about to say is worth waiting for. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable with silence in social situations. When you create conversational space and then hold it patiently rather than rushing to fill it, people say more than they intended. They share things they might not have shared if you'd kept talking. For anyone who works with clients, leads teams, sells ideas, manages relationships, or navigates difficult conversations, this is gold. The processing pause. When someone says something that requires a careful response, a difficult question, a provocative challenge, an unexpected piece of information, the worst thing you can do is answer immediately. The immediate answer is almost always the reactive answer, the emotional answer, the answer that defends your position rather than addresses their concern. And in high-stakes situations, reactive answers consistently make things worse. The processing pause is permission you give yourself to think before you speak. Even 5 seconds of genuine thought in a tense conversation changes the quality of the response dramatically. You move from reactive to intentional, from defensive to strategic. Some of the most powerful phrases in high-stakes communication are simply structured delays. That's an important question. Let me think about that for a moment. I want to make sure I answer this properly. These phrases aren't stalling tactics. They're signals of intellectual integrity. They say, I care enough about this to give you my actual thinking, not my first impulse. The tension pause. This is the most advanced and most counterintuitive form of strategic silence. Sometimes the most powerful move in a difficult conversation is to let an uncomfortable truth sit without immediately rushing to soften it, explain it, or move past it. When you deliver hard feedback and then immediately follow it with reassurance, you've diluted the feedback. When you make a strong point in a negotiation and then immediately start clarifying and qualifying, you've weakened your position. When you identify a serious problem in a meeting and someone quickly pivots to solutions before the gravity of the problem has landed, the problem doesn't get solved. It gets papered over. The tension pause allows weight to land where it belongs. It's the communicator's version of letting silence speak, trusting that the message is strong enough to stand on its own without immediate scaffolding. This requires genuine comfort with discomfort. Most of us, Americans especially, conditioned by a culture that prizes optimism and forward momentum, reflexively smooth over tension the moment it appears. Learning to hold it instead is one of the most powerful communication skills you will ever develop. The Social Calibration Code, reading every room you enter. In 2019, Dr. Sarah Chen walked into the most important presentation of her career. She was a neuroscientist at Stanford who had spent 5 years developing a new framework for cognitive decline research. Her presentation was to a mixed audience of academic researchers, pharmaceutical executives, and foundation funders, and it would determine whether her project received 3 years of continued funding. She had given versions of this talk 30 times. She knew it cold, and within the first 4 minutes, she knew she was losing the room. The academic researchers were leaning forward. The pharmaceutical executives were checking their phones. The foundation funders looked confused. Dr. Chen did something that most presenters never do. She stopped, took a breath, and made a decision in real time. She said, I want to make sure I'm giving you the information most relevant to your specific questions. Dr. Morrison, what matters most to you from a research standpoint? And Marcus, from an application perspective, Where does this connect to what you're working on? By inviting the room to redirect the conversation, she transformed a presentation into a dialogue. The pharmaceutical executives put their phones down. The funders' confusion gave way to specific, answerable questions. The researchers got more depth than they'd expected. She got the funding. But more importantly, she never again walked into a high-stakes room without a strategy for reading it in real time. That skill, reading social environments accurately and adapting your communication accordingly, is what I call social calibration. And it may be the single most valuable communication competency in modern professional life. Reading the room, the 5-point assessment. Before you say anything in a new environment, run a rapid assessment across 5 dimensions. Power. Who has formal authority here, and who has informal influence? These are often different people. The person with the title may defer to the person with the relationships. Knowing who actually shapes decisions, and who shapes the people who shape decisions, tells you who to address and how. Emotional climate. Is this room tense, relaxed, excited, exhausted, or guarded? The emotional temperature of a group is set by the people with the most power in it, and it radiates outward. If the senior person in the room is anxious, everyone will feel slightly anxious without knowing why. Read the energy before you bring your own. Cultural norms. Every organization, every team, every family has unwritten rules about how communication works. In some environments, direct disagreement is encouraged and respected. In others, it's perceived as aggressive and rude. In some rooms, stories and humor build trust. In others, they signal a lack of seriousness. These norms are rarely stated explicitly. They're felt. Information needs. Different people need different things from the same conversation. The CEO needs a strategic summary. The engineer needs technical specifics. The new team member needs context. Speaking in a way that serves one of these audiences while alienating the others is a common and costly mistake. Time pressure. Some conversations have space for depth. Others need efficiency. Failing to read which one you're in, giving a TED talk when someone needs a 2-sentence answer, or giving a 2-sentence answer when someone needs real depth, is a calibration failure that damages your credibility. Adjusting without losing yourself. The most important distinction in social calibration is this: you are adjusting your communication style, not your character. Your values don't change when you walk into a different room. Your core message doesn't change. Your intellectual positions don't change. What changes is how you package and deliver them to serve the specific people you're trying to reach. A great musician doesn't play every concert the same way. They read the room. An outdoor festival crowd needs something different than an intimate jazz club, and they adjust their set, their pacing, their interaction with the audience. But they don't become a different musician. They're just meeting their audience where their audience is. When people confuse social calibration with inauthenticity, it's usually because they've never developed a strong enough sense of their own core identity to adjust the presentation without feeling like they're losing the substance. The stronger your sense of who you are and what you believe, the more freely you can flex your style, because there's nothing at risk of being lost. Real time. Adjustment. Social calibration isn't a one-time read at the beginning of an interaction. It's an ongoing process of monitoring feedback and adjusting as the conversation evolves. People's moods shift. New information enters the room. Power dynamics change when a different person speaks up. What was working 5 minutes ago may not be working now. The feedback signals are everywhere. Are people leaning in or leaning back? Are their questions getting more specific or more skeptical? Is the energy rising or falling? Are people interrupting to add to your point or going quiet in a way that suggests disengagement? These micro-signals are real-time data. Master communicators don't just notice them, they trust them enough to change course mid-conversation when the data calls for it. Not defensively, not apologetically, just smoothly, the way a skilled driver adjusts their grip when the road conditions change. The willingness to adapt without losing confidence is, in itself, a signal of high social intelligence. And people trust high social intelligence. The danger of one-size communication. Let's close this chapter with a word about the most common calibration failure I see in American professional culture: treating every audience the same. The executive who communicates with his direct reports the same way he communicates with the board. The entrepreneur who pitches investors with the same casual energy she uses with her co-founder. The doctor who explains a diagnosis to a patient the same way she explains it to a medical student. These mismatches don't just reduce effectiveness, they actively signal I haven't thought carefully about you specifically, which is the opposite of what you want to communicate when you're trying to build influence, trust, or connection. Every time you walk into a room, the question isn't just, what do I want to say? It's who is here, and what do they need from me? That question, asked sincerely and answered carefully, is the foundation of communication that actually lands. The confidence algorithm, building unshakable self-assurance from the inside out. In the spring of 2014, a 28-year-old software engineer named Marcus Webb walked into his fourth job interview in 3 months. He was technically brilliant. His GitHub profile was immaculate. Every interviewer told him the same thing afterward. Impressive background, clearly smart, just didn't seem confident. One hiring manager put it more bluntly in feedback that somehow made its way back to Marcus. He answered every question, right, but spent the whole interview apologizing for being in the room. Marcus didn't have a knowledge problem. He had a confidence problem. And he was making the same mistake that millions of Americans make about confidence. He was waiting for external circumstances to provide it. He was waiting to feel confident before he acted confident. Waiting for enough experience before he stopped second-guessing himself. Waiting for enough successes before he stopped bracing for failure. Here's what nobody had told Marcus, and what most people never learn. Confidence doesn't come from success. It creates it. This is not motivational rhetoric. It's neuroscience. The brain's confidence architecture is built through action, through repeated encounters with challenging situations that generate evidence of your ability to handle them. You cannot think your way into confidence. You build it the same way you build muscle, through progressive, deliberate, slightly uncomfortable use. Once Marcus understood this, he stopped waiting for confidence to arrive and started constructing it systematically. Within 8 months, he had 3 competing job offers and chose the one that paid 40% more than his previous role. Here is the algorithm he used, and that you can use starting today. Step 1. Build real competence. Confidence cannot be manufactured from nothing. At its foundation, genuine confidence requires genuine capability, the knowledge that you've done the work to actually be good at what you're attempting. This isn't about being the best in the world. It's about knowing that you've prepared seriously, that your thinking is solid, and that you're not walking into the room bluffing. Even partial competence, honestly developed, produces more real confidence than the most elaborate performance of certainty. The corollary is this: confidence built purely on performance, on learning to project certainty without the underlying substance, is fragile in exactly the high-stakes moments when you need it most. Under pressure, it cracks. Competence-based confidence, on the other hand, tends to increase under pressure because difficulty confirms rather than threatens your sense of your own ability. Invest in actual skill development in your specific domain, not to eventually feel confident enough to perform while the confidence develops alongside the competence, each one feeding the other. Step 2. Prepare like your credibility depends on it, because it does. The single most reliable confidence generator in high-stakes situations isn't a breathing technique or a power pose or a pre-game ritual. It's thorough preparation. When you know your material better than anyone in the room needs you to know it, something shifts internally that no technique can replicate. The anxiety of what if I don't know the answer is replaced by the calm of I know this and I'm ready. That internal shift produces the physical and vocal signals that audiences register as confidence because they're reading the genuine article, not a simulation. Preparation mastery extends beyond the content itself. It includes anticipating likely questions and preparing honest, specific answers, thinking through likely objections and deciding in advance how you'll address them. Mentally rehearsing difficult moments, not to eliminate the possibility of being challenged, but to reduce its power to throw you off balance. Prepared people aren't surprised by difficulty. They expected it, and they're ready. That readiness reads as confidence, because it is. Step 3. Build an evidence bank. The brain constructs its confidence architecture from evidence, specific, concrete memories of moments when you handled something difficult and came through. Most people are terrible at collecting this evidence. They experience a success and move immediately to the next challenge without pausing to register what just happened. Meanwhile, they replay failures on a loop, giving them outsized psychological weight. This asymmetry, treating failures as permanent information about your character while treating successes as one-time flukes, is one of the most destructive habits a communicator can have. And it's extraordinarily common in high-achieving, high-pressure American professional culture. Deliberately interrupt this pattern. When you handle a difficult conversation well, notice it explicitly. When you give a presentation that lands, register the specific things you did that made it work. When you navigate conflict without losing your composure, add it to the record. Your brain is running a confidence algorithm, and the quality of its output depends entirely on the quality of the data you feed it. Feed it selectively, and you get distorted, pessimistic output. Feed it accurately, successes and failures both in honest proportion, and you get a realistic, increasingly confident self-assessment. Step 4. Manage your inner narrator. You have a voice in your head that runs constant commentary on your performance. Most people have never examined that voice with any critical distance. They simply accept its narration as objective truth. For a significant percentage of Americans, that inner narrator is running a script that was written decades ago by a demanding parent, a critical teacher, an early experience of failure that got encoded as a permanent verdict about capability. The goal is not to silence the inner narrator. It's to edit the script toward accuracy. Accuracy doesn't mean relentless positivity. It means replacing "I always mess this up" with "I've struggled with this before, and I've also handled it well. Here's what worked." It means replacing "everyone here knows more than I do" with "I bring specific value to this conversation, and I'm here to contribute it." Speak to yourself the way you would speak to a talented colleague who was being unnecessarily hard on themselves, not with empty cheerleading, with honest, specific, constructive recalibration. That reframing, practiced consistently, changes the operating baseline from which you approach every conversation. Step 5. Use your body to change your mind. The connection between physical state and psychological state runs in both directions, a fact that behavioral science has confirmed repeatedly, but that most people still dramatically underutilize. Your posture right now is affecting your confidence right now, not just signaling it to others, actually generating it or suppressing it in your own nervous system. Upright, open posture activates different neurochemical pathways than collapsed, closed posture. Deep, diaphragmatic breathing produces different emotional states than shallow, chest-level breathing. Slow, deliberate movement produces different cognitive output than rushed, reactive movement. Before high-stakes conversations, pay attention to your physical state. Take 2 minutes to stand or sit with genuine alignment. Take 5 slow, deep breaths. Move with intention rather than anxiety. These practices aren't performance, they're preparation. You're using your body to set the physiological conditions under which your best thinking and best communication become most accessible. Step 6. Expand your comfort zone. Systematically, confidence is fundamentally a record of your successful navigation of unfamiliar terrain. The more diverse the terrain you've crossed, the more confident you can be about crossing new terrain. This means deliberately seeking out situations that are slightly beyond your current comfort level, not so far beyond that they're overwhelming, but far enough that they require genuine stretch. Public speaking when you're comfortable in one-on-ones. Initiating difficult conversations when you'd normally let things slide. Taking a leadership role in a group where you'd normally defer. Contributing your perspective in a room full of people more senior than you. Each of these experiences, particularly when they go reasonably well and even when they don't, adds to your evidence bank and expands the perimeter of what feels manageable. Over time, the perimeter becomes genuinely large, and that's what unshakable confidence actually is. Not the absence of discomfort, but such an extensive history of navigating discomfort that it no longer feels like a reason not to act. Step 7. Know who you are. The deepest layer of the confidence algorithm is identity. All the preparation and competence and evidence in the world produces a particular kind of confidence, situational, skill-based, context-dependent. That's valuable. But the most durable confidence, the kind that remains steady when circumstances go sideways, when you're in an unfamiliar room, when people are challenging you in ways you didn't anticipate, comes from something simpler and more fundamental. It comes from knowing who you are. What do you actually value? What are the principles you won't compromise regardless of social pressure? What kind of person are you trying to be in your professional and personal life? What do you know to be true about yourself? Not because others have confirmed it, but because you've lived it. When your communication is rooted in a clear, honest answer to these questions, you carry a groundedness into every room that technical skill alone cannot produce. You're not performing confidence, you're expressing it. And the difference, in how you feel and how others experience you, is unmistakable. Advanced influence. The psychology of getting what you want without force power, in most American professional environments, is understood as something you take, you assert it, you claim it, you demonstrate it by winning. This model is not entirely wrong, but it's incomplete in ways that cost most people enormous influence over the course of a career. The deepest and most durable form of influence doesn't feel like force to the person. Experiencing it, it feels like insight, like being genuinely understood, like arriving at a conclusion that you reached yourself, that happened to align perfectly with what the person across from you was hoping you'd conclude. When influence works this way, something remarkable happens. People don't just comply, they commit. They feel ownership over the decision. They become advocates for the outcome rather than reluctant participants in it. Here are the advanced techniques that create this kind of influence. Technique 1. Reframe the assumptions. Every person you're trying to influence is operating inside a set of assumptions they haven't consciously examined about what's possible, what's normal, what's reasonable to expect. These invisible frames are more powerful than any explicit objection because they're never raised as objections. They simply quietly exclude certain possibilities from consideration. The most effective influence often begins not with a compelling argument, but with a disruptive question that makes an invisible assumption visible. What if we didn't have to choose between quality and speed? What would this look like if we started from scratch instead of fixing what we have? Has anyone asked the customers directly what they'd actually pay for? None of these are arguments. They're invitations to think differently. And when the other person's thinking changes, their conclusions change, and they feel like those new conclusions belong to them, because they do. Technique 2. Orchestrate social proof. Human beings are social animals who look to others for guidance about what to think and do, especially in situations of genuine uncertainty. This isn't a character flaw, it's rational. Most of us don't have the expertise to independently evaluate every decision we face, so we use others' choices as evidence of the right path. When people we respect have made a particular decision, that decision starts looking more reasonable to us. Skilled influence practitioners understand this and deploy social proof with surgical precision, finding the specific example, the specific person, the specific outcome that maps most closely onto the values and concerns of the person they're trying to move. Generic testimonials don't work because they're generic. What works is specificity. This is almost identical to the challenge Marcus faced at his company 3 years ago, and here's what happened when he took this approach. When the example is close enough to feel personal, the social proof is real. Technique 3. Reframe the frame. Facts are neutral. They become meaningful only through the frame we place around them. A surgeon's technique can be described as having a 90% survival rate or a 10% mortality rate. Both statements are equally true. But decades of research in behavioral economics, pioneered by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, show that people respond to these frames dramatically differently. Most patients choose the surgery when told about the 90% survival rate and significantly fewer when told about the 10% mortality rate. This is not deception. The facts haven't changed. What's changed is which aspect of the truth you're illuminating. Skilled communicators learn to identify the frame currently operating in a conversation and ask whether a different frame would serve the situation better. Not to manipulate, but to help people see the full picture when their current frame is giving them only part of it. From problems to solutions, from costs to investments, from risk to opportunity, from what we're losing to what we're building. The same reality, more useful light. Technique 4. Give first. Robert Cialdini's research on reciprocity is one of the most replicated findings in all of social psychology. People feel a strong, largely unconscious obligation to return what they've been given. This principle is most powerful when the giving is unexpected, personalized, and clearly focused on the recipient's needs rather than on creating obligation. When you genuinely help someone, sharing relevant information they needed, making an introduction that mattered to them, taking time to give thoughtful feedback on their work, they experience something that creates a genuine desire, not a calculated obligation, to reciprocate. The distinction between authentic generosity and strategic manipulation is real, and people sense it. Give because you actually care about being useful. Let the reciprocity follow naturally. Don't give and then immediately ask. Give and trust that goodwill compounds. Technique 5. Connect to existing commitments. People feel strong psychological pressure to remain consistent with their previous commitments, stated values, and public positions. This isn't weakness. It's the foundation of integrity and social trust. When you can genuinely and honestly connect your proposal to something the other person has already committed to, the alignment does much of the persuasion work for you. This approach directly supports the customer-first culture you've been building. You mentioned in our last conversation that speed to market was the top priority. This is the path that gets us there fastest. This is consistent with the direction you outlined in the all-hands meeting. We'd be operationalizing that vision. You're not creating pressure. You're creating coherence. And coherence feels like alignment, which is one of the most comfortable feelings a decision-maker can have. Technique 6. Make yes easy. Even when someone genuinely wants to move forward, they can talk themselves out of it if the path forward feels complicated, risky, or ambiguous. Reduce the friction everywhere you can. Offer a low-commitment first step that creates momentum without requiring full commitment up front. Handle the logistics. Eliminate the paperwork. Prepare the summary document they'd otherwise have to create. Make the next action so clear and so simple that the only real question is whether they want the outcome, not whether they can manage the process. This is one of the most underappreciated elements of influence. Motivation and friction are both real forces. Reducing friction is often more effective than increasing motivation. Technique 7. Match their emotional reality. People make emotional decisions. We've established this. But there's a subtler layer that most communicators miss. People don't just make emotional decisions. They make decisions that match their current emotional state. When someone is in a problem-focused mindset, solutions feel premature. When someone is in a cautious mindset, bold proposals feel threatening. When someone is feeling disrespected or dismissed, even a genuinely good idea lands poorly because the emotional channel is closed. Before you can influence someone's thinking, you need to join them in their emotional reality. Not perform it. Join it. Acknowledge what they're dealing with, what they're feeling, what they're worried about. Let them know you've actually heard them before you invite them to consider something new. When people feel genuinely met where they are, they become far more open to being led somewhere different. Crisis communication. How to lead. When everything is falling apart. On January 15, 2009, U.S. Airways Flight 1549 struck a flock of geese shortly after takeoff from LaGuardia Airport and lost thrust in both engines. Captain Chesley Sully Sullenberger had approximately 208 seconds between the bird strike and the moment he needed to land a 150,000-pound commercial aircraft on the Hudson River. What he did in those 208 seconds has been analyzed by aviation experts, psychologists, and leadership researchers ever since. But here is what matters for our purposes. In the middle of a catastrophic crisis, with no precedent and no safety net and 155 lives in his hands, Sully communicated with the most striking quality you could imagine. Calm. Not detachment. Not suppression. Not the absence of awareness that the situation was serious. But genuine, grounded, functional calm. The kind that came from a lifetime of preparation, a deeply internalized set of priorities, and the trained ability to regulate his own nervous system under pressure. He didn't announce that they might die. He told his crew to brace for impact, contacted air traffic control with a level voice, and executed a water landing that had never been successfully accomplished before in commercial aviation. Every person on that plane survived. Sully's communication in those 208 seconds is one of the most powerful demonstrations of crisis communication principles ever recorded, and the principles he embodied, knowingly or not, are exactly what separates leaders who gain influence during crises from those who lose it. Principle 1. Regulate first, respond second. In a crisis, your emotional state is the first variable you must manage because it's broadcasting constantly and everyone around you is reading it. The moment people sense that the person in charge is panicking, two things happen immediately. Their own anxiety escalates sharply, and their confidence in the leader's judgment collapses. This doesn't mean pretending everything is fine. It means processing the reality of the situation, including the fear and urgency, internally before it comes out in your communication in ways that amplify panic rather than reduce it. The physiological tools for this are straightforward. Controlled breathing slows the heart rate and reduces cortisol. A brief internal pause before speaking prevents reactive statements. Grounding your attention in the specific facts of the situation rather than the worst-case scenarios prevents catastrophizing. Regulate, then respond. The 3 to 5 seconds this takes will produce dramatically better communication than the immediate reactive response that an unregulated nervous system generates. Principle 2. Be transparent about what you know and don't know. In a crisis, people's anxiety is driven less by the facts of the situation than by uncertainty about the facts. When information is absent, people invent it, and their inventions are almost always worse than reality. This means the most important communication discipline during a crisis is proactive information sharing. Regular updates, even brief ones, clear statements of what you know, what you don't know, and when you expect to know more. Here's what we know right now. Here's what we're actively working to understand. We'll have an update by 3 p.m. This structure is simple and powerful. It takes a terrifying information vacuum and replaces it with a manageable framework. It signals that someone is in control, thinking clearly, and committed to keeping people informed. That signal alone reduces anxiety substantially, even before any specific problem has been solved. Principle 3. Lead toward solutions, not away from problems. Under pressure, the human brain defaults to problem analysis, trying to understand what went wrong, who's responsible, and how bad things might get. This instinct has its place. You need to understand a problem before you can solve it. But skilled crisis communicators recognize the moment when continued problem analysis stops generating insight and starts generating paralysis, and they redirect the conversation toward action. We understand what happened. Let's focus on what we do next. This is a deceptively simple shift. It moves energy from the past, where nothing can be changed, to the future, where choices remain available. It repositions the team from victims of circumstances to agents with options, and it models the orientation, forward-looking, solution-focused, action-oriented, that produces actual outcomes rather than an increasingly sophisticated understanding of why things are bad. Principle 4. Speak differently to different stakeholders. A crisis typically affects multiple groups of people simultaneously, and each group needs something different from your communication. Your immediate team needs specific guidance. What to do right now? Who's responsible for what? When to check back in? Clarity and direction above all else. Senior leadership needs strategic framing. What happened, what you're doing about it, what you anticipate the outcome to be, and what resources or decisions you need from them. External stakeholders, clients, customers, partners, need reassurance and transparency, acknowledgement of the situation, clear communication about how it affects them specifically, and honest information about what you're doing to address it. One of the most common crisis communication failures is using the same message for all three audiences. The team message terrifies senior leaders. The senior leadership message confuses the team. The external stakeholder message frustrates everyone. Tailor the message to the audience, always. Principle 5. Be decisive, with incomplete information. Crises don't wait for complete information before requiring decisions. The perfectionist instinct, I'll act when I fully understand the situation, is exactly backwards in a crisis, where delay consistently makes things worse. And the information you're waiting for often can't be obtained without acting first. This requires developing a different relationship with uncertainty, not ignoring it, not pretending you have answers you don't, but being willing to make the best decision you can with the information currently available, communicate it clearly, and adjust as new information comes in. Based on what we know right now, here's what we're doing. As we learn more, we'll adjust. Right now, this is the call. Decisive communication under uncertainty signals leadership. It tells the people around you that someone is steering, that this is not a situation without a driver. That signal is worth more in a genuine crisis than waiting for certainty that will never arrive. Principle 6. Protect your reputation while solving the problem. How you communicate during a crisis becomes a permanent part of how people remember you. People don't primarily remember the crisis itself over the long term. They remember how the leader handled it, whether they were honest, whether they stayed composed, whether they kept their commitments, whether they prioritized the right things under pressure. This means that your communication choices during a crisis are simultaneously crisis management and reputation management, and the two are completely aligned. Being honest, composed, clear, and accountable during a crisis is both the right thing to do and the most strategically effective thing to do. Avoid deflecting responsibility for things that were genuinely within your influence. Avoid overpromising what you can deliver. Avoid the temptation to communicate optimism you don't feel. People read false optimism as dishonesty, and dishonesty in a crisis is devastating to trust. Be real, be clear, deliver what you commit to. Your reputation after the crisis will reflect exactly how well you managed these three things. Principle 7. Use the crisis to build deeper trust. Here is the counterintuitive truth about crises. Handled well, they are among the most powerful relationship-building experiences available to a leader. When people see you stay grounded under pressure, communicate honestly when it would be easier not to, follow through on commitments made in difficult circumstances, and prioritize their well-being alongside the operational challenges, they trust you in a way that years of smooth sailing simply cannot produce. The bond formed through shared adversity is different in kind from the bond formed through shared success. It's tested, it's proven, it knows something about who you actually are. The leaders who emerge from crises with stronger relationships than they entered them didn't get lucky. They communicated with such clarity, composure, honesty, and care that the crisis became evidence, the best possible kind of evidence, of exactly the person others had been hoping they were dealing with. Building communication systems that compound over time. In 1994, a young attorney named James Okafor joined a mid-sized law firm in Atlanta with 40 other first-year associates. By every measurable standard, James was average. His law school GPA was solid but not exceptional. His bar exam scores were unremarkable. His writing was competent. His legal reasoning was sound. He had no family connections at the firm, no political capital, no obvious advantage. By 2004, he was a named partner. 37 of his original 40 cohort had left the firm. 3 had made partner. James was the only one anyone inside or outside the firm pointed to as genuinely influential, not just successful, but the kind of lawyer that clients called and other attorneys sought out. What was different about James? His former colleagues gave remarkably consistent answers when asked this question. It wasn't his legal brilliance, though he was good. It wasn't his work ethic, though he worked hard. It was something harder to name. A cumulative quality of presence that had grown steadily, year over year, until he had become someone people genuinely relied on, trusted, and wanted in the room. When James was asked directly, he said something that has stayed with me. "I never thought about individual conversations. I thought about what kind of communicator I was becoming. Every conversation was one more data point in a long story I was writing about who I was professionally. I just tried to make sure the story was worth reading." That is the essence of building communication systems that create lasting influence. It is not a sprint. It is a compound interest curve, slow at first, almost invisible, and then suddenly dramatically steep. Here is how you build it deliberately. Element 1. Message consistency. Across every context. Your core professional identity, the things you stand for, the perspective you bring, the value you consistently add, should be recognizable whether someone encounters you in a boardroom, a hallway conversation, an email, or a crisis. This doesn't mean being repetitive or robotic. It means having enough clarity about who you are and what you contribute that these qualities naturally surface across diverse situations. The most influential communicators in any organization have what you might call a signature, a consistent quality of thinking, a reliable perspective, a particular kind of value that people have come to expect and depend on. When they speak, others don't wonder what angle they'll take. They've come to know. And that predictability, paradoxically, makes them more trusted rather than less interesting. Develop your signature by asking yourself regularly, what is the specific, distinctive value I bring to conversations? What do I want people to think of when they think of me professionally? Then find ways to express those qualities consistently, not performatively but authentically, across every communication surface you have. Element 2. Relationship mapping and strategic investment. Influence flows through relationships. This is not a soft observation. It is the structural reality of how organizations, industries, and communities actually work. Information travels through relationships. Opportunities get surfaced through relationships. Decisions get made in conversations that happen within relationships. The person with the broadest and deepest relationship network in any environment is, almost by definition, the person with the most influence in that environment. But most people approach relationship building the same way they approach networking events. Inefficiently, superficially, and without any real strategy for which relationships deserve the most investment. Strategic relationship mapping means genuinely understanding the ecosystem you operate in, who influences whom, who controls which resources, who is emerging as important, and who connects to communities you don't yet have access to. And then investing your relational energy with the same intentionality you'd apply to any other important resource. This is not cynical. The relationships worth investing in strategically are exactly the relationships worth having genuinely. With people who are doing interesting work, thinking carefully about important problems and building things that matter. Strategic and authentic are not opposites. The best professional relationships are both. Element 3. Expertise, positioning. At some point in a career, technical skill stops being the primary differentiator. Nearly everyone at a certain level is technically capable. What separates the most influential professionals is the perception of distinctive expertise, the sense that this particular person sees something others don't, thinks about a domain in a way that others haven't, and brings insight that can't be found anywhere else in the building. This perception is not simply discovered, it is built. Through consistent, visible thinking, in meetings, in writing, in the questions you ask, in the frameworks you offer for understanding problems, you gradually establish a reputation as someone who knows things worth knowing about a particular domain, thought. Leadership doesn't require a podcast or a book or 1,000 LinkedIn followers. It requires a genuine, developed point of view on something relevant to the people around you and the habit of sharing that point of view clearly and consistently over time. What do you know that's worth knowing? What perspective do you have that others in your environment haven't fully considered? Start there. Share it clearly and repeatedly. Let it compound. Element 4. Systematic feedback and continuous improvement. Most people receive almost no meaningful feedback about their communication. They walk out of presentations, conversations, and meetings without a clear sense of what worked, what didn't, and what they'd do differently next time. This feedback vacuum is a major reason why communication skills plateau. Without accurate information about your actual impact, you have no way to distinguish between approaches that are genuinely working and habits you've simply grown comfortable with, regardless of their effectiveness. Build feedback systems deliberately. Ask specific questions after important communications. Was my point clear? Did the structure make sense? What would have made this more useful? Find 2 or 3 people in your professional life who will give you genuinely honest input, not the social reassurance most people offer after a difficult conversation. Record yourself. Watch the recording without cringing long enough to learn something. The camera sees things you can't feel from the inside. The pacing, the filler words, the moments when your energy drops, the physical habits you don't know you have. Treat feedback as the primary fuel of improvement rather than the uncomfortable byproduct of occasional evaluations. The communicators who improve fastest are not the most talented. They are the most honest with themselves about what's actually happening in their conversations. Element 5. Platform development and visibility influence requires visibility. Ideas that never leave your head don't change anything. Communication that only reaches a small circle creates only small circle influence. Building lasting communication influence requires systematically expanding the reach of your ideas beyond your immediate environment through presentations, writing, leadership roles, committee participation, industry involvement, mentorship, and any other platform that gives your thinking access to a broader audience. This is not about self-promotion. It is about the simple reality that your ability to create value for others depends partly on how many others know you exist and what you can offer. Most Americans dramatically underinvest in visibility out of either modesty or inertia. They do good work and assume it will be recognized. Sometimes it is, often it isn't, because recognition requires active communication, not just passive quality. Volunteer for the presentation others avoid. Write the summary memo that nobody asked for, but everyone reads. Take the leadership role on the project that's visible to senior people. Create the content that would have been useful to you 3 years ago and share it with people who are where you were then. Good work, quietly done, produces a modest return. Good work, clearly communicated, produces an exponential one. Element 6. Developing others. Here is a truth that takes most professionals years to fully absorb. The most powerful thing you can do for your own influence is invest genuinely in the communication development of the people around you. When you help others become better communicators, clearer thinkers, more confident speakers, more effective in their most important conversations, several things happen simultaneously. You reinforce your own learning by teaching it. You build loyalty and goodwill that creates natural advocates for your work. You establish a reputation as a leader who builds people rather than just using them. And you create a network of capable communicators who share your frameworks and approaches. extending your influence into rooms you'll never personally enter. The most influential communicators in any organization are almost always people who have made others better, not because they were trying to be generous, though they were, but because developing others is simply the most leveraged investment of communication skill available. Element 7. Legacy through institutional change. The highest expression of communication influence is not individual, it's systemic. It's the kind of influence that changes how an organization thinks, operates, or communicates, changes that persist long after you've moved on. This might mean establishing a communication standard that your team adopts and maintains, creating a feedback culture where honest, direct conversation becomes the norm rather than the exception, introducing a framework for thinking about a problem that outlasts your involvement with it, training people who go on to train others. Legacy influence is built through the same mechanisms as individual influence: clarity, consistency, genuine investment in others, but applied at the level of systems and cultures rather than individual conversations. It takes longer, it's harder to measure, and it produces the most durable, meaningful return available to anyone who has genuinely mastered the principles in this book. The charisma formula. Manufacturing magnetic presence on demand. Let's start with the most common misconception about charisma in American culture. Most people think charismatic people are good at being the center of attention. They're entertaining, they're funny, they have great stories, they command the room through sheer force of personality. Some charismatic people do have these qualities, but they're not what charisma actually is, and mistaking them for the source of charisma is what keeps most people from ever developing it. Real charisma has almost nothing to do with being captivating. It has everything to do with making others feel captivated by themselves when they're around you. Think about the most charismatic person you've personally known. Not a celebrity, someone in your actual life. What made them magnetic? If you reflect honestly, it was probably not that they were the best storyteller in the room. It was that they made you feel, in some specific way, seen, heard, interesting, like the things you were saying and thinking actually mattered to them. That quality, the ability to make another person feel genuinely important in your presence, is the foundation of all real charisma. And it is absolutely learnable. Element 1. Presence. Intensity. In an era of fractured attention, complete focus on another human being is among the rarest experiences available. Most people you interact with are partially somewhere else, thinking about their next meeting, monitoring their notifications, composing their next response while you're still delivering your current one. You can feel it, the subtle absence, the sense that while their body is in the conversation, their mind has already moved on. Presence. Intensity means directing your complete attention to whoever is in front of you, not performing attention, actually being there, letting the other person's words land before you formulate your response. Being genuinely curious about what they're about to say next, rather than already certain you know. This level of attention is so rare that it reads as almost supernatural when people experience it. They feel, in a way they often can't articulate, that you are someone worth being around, that their time with you is qualitatively different from their time with almost everyone else. The discipline required is simple and difficult in equal measure. Put your phone away. Don't scan the room. Don't compose your next sentence before they've finished their current one. Be completely, genuinely here. Element 2. Emotional attunement. Charismatic people are extraordinarily skilled at reading the emotional subtext of a conversation, the feeling beneath the words, the concern behind the question, the pride or anxiety or uncertainty that the other person isn't explicitly naming. And then they respond to that, to the actual emotional experience, rather than just to the surface content. When someone tells you about a work project with slightly forced enthusiasm, and you respond to the actual emotional note rather than the performed one, that sounds like it's been more complicated than you expected. Something powerful happens. They feel understood in a way that goes deeper than the normal social exchange. They feel met. This kind of emotional attunement is not therapy. It doesn't require lengthy exploration or professional training. It requires only the willingness to pay attention to what someone is actually feeling rather than just what they're saying, and the courage to name it gently and without presumption. Element 3. Genuine curiosity. Here is an uncomfortable truth about most professional conversations in America. Both parties are waiting for their turn to talk. Questions get asked not because the asker genuinely wants to know the answer, but because asking a question signals engagement and buys time before the real agenda, sharing one's own perspective, resumes. Charismatic people are different. They are actually genuinely curious about the people they're talking to, not because curiosity is strategic, but because they've developed an authentic interest in other human beings, their experiences, their thinking, their challenges, their perspective on things that neither party fully understands. This genuine curiosity shows up in the quality of questions. Follow-up questions that couldn't have been prepared in advance because they respond to what was actually said. Wait, say more about that. What made that particular moment the turning point? These questions signal that you were listening closely enough to want to go deeper. That signal is felt immediately, and it opens people up in ways that prepared questions never do. You cannot manufacture genuine curiosity through technique, but you can cultivate it by practicing the habit of finding one genuinely interesting thing about every person you interact with. The habit, practiced consistently, gradually becomes an orientation, a way of moving through the world that makes every conversation potentially interesting rather than potentially tedious. Element 4. Energy management. Emotional states are contagious. This is not metaphor. It's neuroscience. Mirror neurons in the human brain cause us to unconsciously replicate the emotional states of people around us, particularly people we're paying attention to. This means that every time you interact with someone, you are affecting their emotional state, for better or worse, intentionally or not. Charismatic people understand this and take responsibility for the emotional environment they create. They bring appropriate energy to every context, not a performed, manufactured positivity, but a genuine groundedness and engagement that tends to elevate the emotional tone of whatever room they're in. This requires self-awareness about your own emotional state, knowing when you're carrying stress, frustration, or distraction into an interaction, and managing those states before they infect the conversation. It also requires range. Different situations call for different energy. The calm certainty that's right for a crisis is different from the enthusiastic engagement that's right for a brainstorming session, which is different from the quiet warmth that's right for a difficult personal conversation. Charismatic people have this range and deploy it with genuine sensitivity to what the moment requires. Element 5. Strategic vulnerability. Of all the elements of the charisma formula, this is the one that surprises people most. Real charisma includes the willingness to be genuinely human, to acknowledge struggle, admit uncertainty, and share the honest complexity of your experience rather than projecting an impeccable surface. This is not emotional dumping. It is not sharing every insecurity or performing vulnerability for effect. It is the selective, genuine disclosure of your real experience in ways that make the other person feel less alone in theirs. When a leader tells a team that navigating this particular challenge is genuinely hard, that she doesn't have all the answers, and that she's figuring it out too, and then proceeds to lead with competence and commitment, something powerful happens. She becomes human, reachable, real, and people follow humans in ways they never follow performances. The vulnerability must be real to work. Performed vulnerability is immediately transparent and produces the opposite effect. It reads as manipulation, which erodes exactly the trust it was designed to build. But genuine, calibrated openness about your real experience creates connection that polished competence alone can never achieve. Element 6, generous recognition. Charismatic people are extraordinarily generous with specific, genuine praise, not the reflexive great job that everyone dispenses and no one believes. Specific recognition that demonstrates you are paying attention. The way you handled that objection in the middle of the presentation, that was impressive. I've seen experienced presenters lose their footing at that exact moment, and you didn't. That kind of recognition does three things. It makes the person feel seen in a specific, meaningful way. It demonstrates that you were paying close enough attention to notice the detail. And it associates you, in their mind, with one of the most positive emotional experiences available to a human being, the experience of being genuinely recognized for something that mattered. Charismatic people give this experience away constantly. They look for what's working, what's impressive, what's worth acknowledging, and then they acknowledge it clearly, specifically, and without any obvious agenda. It costs nothing. It compounds enormously. Difficult conversations. The skill that separates good leaders from great ones. In 2017, a survey of 1,400 American executives found that the average senior leader was avoiding at least 3 significant conversations at any given moment. Conversations about underperformance, misaligned expectations, relational friction, or strategic disagreement that they knew needed to happen and kept finding reasons to delay. The cost of those avoided conversations, measured in accumulated tension, degraded performance, and damaged relationships, was by conservative estimates in the tens of millions of dollars annually across the organizations surveyed. But the more striking finding was this. When those same executives were asked what prevented them from having the conversations, the most common answer wasn't lack of time or lack of opportunity. It was lack of skill. They didn't know how to have these conversations without either damaging the relationship or failing to address the issue. So they chose the third option that nobody acknowledges as a choice. They had neither conversation and paid the full price of avoidance. Difficult conversations are not the exception in professional and personal life. They are a recurring, unavoidable feature of it. The ability to navigate them skillfully, preserving both the relationship and the honest truth, is one of the highest leverage communication competencies you can develop. Principle 1. Clarity of intent. Before you speak, before you initiate any difficult conversation, you must answer one question with complete honesty. What outcome do I actually want? Not what you want to say, not what you want the other person to understand. What outcome? The actual changed state of the situation, the relationship, or the other person's behavior? Are you trying to create? This sounds obvious. It isn't. Most people walk into difficult conversations with a vague intention to address the issue without any clarity about what resolution would actually look like. And without that clarity, conversations meander, escalate, or end with mutual discomfort and no real change. Clarity of intent also requires honesty about your own emotional state. Are you trying to solve a problem, or are you primarily trying to express frustration? Both are valid at times, but they require different conversations. Confusing them produces conversations that accomplish neither. Principle 2. Start with respect, not accusation. The opening of a difficult conversation sets a trajectory that is very hard to reverse. Open aggressively, and defensiveness is the immediate and nearly inevitable response. Defensiveness closes the other person's thinking and produces counterattack. And now you're in a conflict rather than a conversation. Open with genuine respect for the relationship, for the other person's perspective, for the difficulty of what you're both about to navigate, and you create the conditions for actual dialogue. I want to talk about something that's been on my mind, and I want to do it in a way that's fair to both of us. I value our working relationship too much to let this go unaddressed. Can we find 30 minutes to talk honestly? These openings signal the same thing. I am not your adversary. I am someone who cares enough about this to do the hard work of addressing it directly and honestly. Principle 3. Separate facts from interpretations. One of the most reliable ways to derail a difficult conversation is to present your interpretation of events as if it were objective reality. "You don't respect my time" is an interpretation. "Our last 3 meetings started more than 15 minutes late" is a fact. "You're not committed to this project" is an interpretation. "The deliverable was 3 days past deadline, and I didn't hear from you about the delay until the morning it was due" is a fact. When you lead with interpretations, the other person's natural response is to challenge the interpretation, and suddenly you're arguing about subjective perceptions rather than solving a concrete problem. The conversation becomes about who's right rather than what to do. When you lead with facts, specific, observable, inarguable, you give the other person something to respond to that doesn't require them to defend their character. The conversation can focus on the situation rather than the verdict. Principle 4. Listen to understand, not to respond. In difficult conversations, the natural tendency is to use the time while the other person is talking to prepare your counter-argument. This is a conversation killer. People know when they're not being heard. They escalate to be heard. The conversation spirals. Genuine listening in a difficult conversation means being willing to update your understanding based on what the other person tells you. Not performing openness while privately remaining certain, but actually holding the possibility that there is real, important information in their perspective that would change how you see the situation if you let it in. This requires a particular kind of intellectual courage, the willingness to be wrong, or at least incomplete, in your assessment. Not every time. Not when someone is simply making excuses, but often enough to find the genuine misunderstanding or legitimate concern that, when addressed, allows the conversation to move from conflict to resolution. Principle 5. Find the common ground. Even in the most heated disagreements, there is almost always shared ground. Outcomes both parties want, values both parties hold, concerns both parties share. Finding and naming this common ground is one of the most powerful moves available in a difficult conversation because it shifts the dynamic from adversarial to collaborative. Suddenly, both parties are on the same side of a problem rather than opposite sides of a conflict. "I think we both want this project to succeed." It sounds like we're both frustrated, which tells me we both care about getting this right. We want the same outcome. We're just disagreeing about the path. These observations aren't manipulation. When they're true, and they usually are, naming them out loud changes the emotional tone of the conversation immediately and creates the collaborative space in which actual solutions become possible. Principle 6. Close with clarity and commitment. More difficult conversations fail at the end than at the beginning. The conversation goes reasonably well, Both parties feel some relief that the issue has been addressed. There's a general sense of having reached some kind of resolution, and then both people walk away with completely different understandings of what was decided, who is doing what, and what happens next. 3 weeks later, the same issue surfaces again. And now there's an additional layer of frustration because both parties believed it had already been resolved. Close every difficult conversation with explicit agreement about specific next steps, not vague intentions, specific commitments. Who is doing what, by when, and when you'll check back in to assess whether things have actually changed. This specificity is not bureaucratic. It is respectful. It says, this conversation mattered enough to actually follow through on. Let's make sure we both know what following through looks like. Digital communication mastery, influence in the attention economy. In the summer of 2021, a product manager named Deja Williams sent an email that changed the trajectory of her career. It wasn't a long email, it was 4 paragraphs. But every word had been chosen carefully, every sentence had a specific job to do, and the subject line alone, 12 words that captured a genuine insight about their company's biggest unsolved problem, got it forwarded 3 times before it reached the CEO. She wasn't in the room when it landed. She wasn't a senior leader. She had no special access or political capital. She had a clear idea, expressed with precision and confidence, delivered at the right moment through the right channel to the right people. 6 months later, she was leading the initiative she'd proposed. The digital revolution hasn't reduced the importance of communication. It has amplified it, while simultaneously raising the bar for what it takes to break through. The average American professional receives between 120 and 150 emails per day. They scroll through hundreds of social media posts. They sit in video calls, respond to instant messages, navigate document comment threads, and manage Slack channels all simultaneously, all day, every day. In this environment, mediocre communication doesn't just underperform, it disappears. Here is what separates the communicators who cut through from the vast majority who generate noise. Principle 1. Platform intelligence. Every digital platform has its own grammar, its own norms, rhythms, expectations, and unspoken rules about what works and what gets ignored. Email rewards clarity, structure, and respect for the reader's time. A well-written email has a subject line that tells the reader exactly what they're getting, a first sentence that confirms it's worth reading, a middle that delivers on that promise efficiently, and a clear, specific ask or action at the end. Anything that doesn't serve those functions is friction, and friction in email is fatal. Slack and instant messaging reward brevity and directness. Long Slack messages read as inconsiderate of other people's context-switching cost. The most effective Slack communicators say what they need in 2 sentences, use threading intelligently to keep conversations organized, and know when a conversation has outgrown the medium and needs to move to a call. Video calls reward physical presence, eye contact, and energy management in ways that are different from, but just as important as, in-person communication. The person who looks confidently into the camera rather than at their own thumbnail, who speaks at a pace calibrated for the slight audio delay, who uses strategic pauses that read as thoughtfulness rather than technical lag. That person carries authority in a virtual room that others, using identical words, simply don't. Know the grammar of every platform you use. Violating those grammars isn't edgy, it's just noise. Principle 2. The first sentence does all the work. In digital environments, you have approximately 3 seconds before someone decides whether your message is worth their attention. Not 3 minutes. 3 seconds. This means the opening of Every digital communication you send carries disproportionate weight. The subject line of an email, the first sentence of a message, the opening frame of a video. These are not introductions. They are arguments for why the rest deserves attention. Strong digital openings do one of three things. They signal immediate relevance. This directly affects the Q3 launch timeline. They create genuine curiosity. I found something in the data that changes how we've been thinking about this. Or they establish personal connection. After our conversation last week, I went and dug into this. Week openings. Hope you're doing well. Following up on my last email, I wanted to reach out about. Signal to the reader's brain that nothing important is about to happen. And in an environment where every other message is competing for the same limited attention, that signal is a death sentence for your message. Lead with the thing that matters, immediately. Principle 3. Emotional connection, without physical presence. One of the genuine challenges of digital communication is that the channels through which emotional connection most naturally flows, physical presence, vocal tone, facial expression, eye contact, are either absent or significantly diminished. This doesn't mean emotional connection is impossible in digital formats. It means you have to work harder and more deliberately to create it. The most powerful tool for emotional connection in digital communication is specificity. Generic messages feel like broadcasts. Specific messages feel like conversations. When you reference something the other person actually said, actually did, actually cares about, when your message could only have been written to them and couldn't have been copied and pasted to 30 other people, they feel it. And feeling it is the beginning of connection. Personal storytelling carries unusual weight in digital communication for the same reason. In a world of curated surfaces and professional performances, the communicator who shares something genuinely human, a real challenge, a real lesson, a moment of real uncertainty, creates a kind of intimacy that cuts through the digital distance in ways that polished content rarely can. Be specific. Be human. Be willing to be real. Principle 4. Credibility in the age of noise. Digital environments have created an interesting paradox. They've made it easier than ever to say anything and harder than ever to be believed. The volume of information, much of it false, much of it exaggerated, most of it undifferentiated, has made audiences deeply skeptical of claims they encounter online. The result is that credibility has become one of the scarcest and most valuable currencies in digital communication. Digital credibility is built slowly and destroyed quickly. It requires consistency between what you say and what you do. People will check. It requires honesty about uncertainty. Over-claiming in digital environments is immediately punishable by the audience. It requires a track record of being useful over time rather than just impressive in isolated moments. The most credible digital communicators are not the ones with the most followers or the most polished content. They're the ones whose communication has proven reliable over time, whose analysis turned out to be correct, whose recommendations turned out to be useful, whose assessments of situations turned out to be honest. That track record, built incrementally over months and years, is the foundation of digital influence that actually lasts. Principle 5. Timing and frequency. When you communicate digitally matters almost as much as what you say. Every audience has patterns of attention, times when they're most receptive, most engaged, most likely to respond. For most American professionals, early morning before the day becomes reactive, and the focused late morning hours before lunch tend to be highest attention windows. Messages sent at 4:47 p.m. on a Friday tend to disappear. Messages sent at 8:15 a.m. on Tuesday tend to land. Frequency matters equally. Too little communication and you become invisible, irrelevant, easy to forget. Too much, and you become noise, something to filter out. A sender whose name in the inbox generates a reflexive sense of obligation rather than anticipation. The goal is to be the communicator whose messages people look forward to, whose emails they actually open, whose updates they actually read. This is achieved not through tricks or optimization hacks, but through the same quality that makes all communication compelling, saying things worth saying to people who actually need to hear them at times when they're positioned to receive them. Principle 6. Building a digital presence that compounds your digital communication, taken cumulatively over months and years, constitutes a public record of how you think, what you value, and what you contribute. This record is either building your reputation or eroding it. There is no neutral ground. Every email you send to a professional contact, every comment you make in a public forum, every piece of content you share under your name is adding to a cumulative impression that others use to assess your credibility, your judgment, and your worth. The professionals who build the most powerful digital presences do so through the same discipline that underlies all lasting influence: consistent, genuine, high-quality contribution over time. They share insights that are actually insightful. They offer analysis that is actually useful. They acknowledge uncertainty honestly. They engage with others' ideas generously and thoughtfully. There is no shortcut to this compound effect, but there is a starting point. Begin communicating digitally with the same intentionality, precision, and care that you'd bring to your most important in-person conversation. Not occasionally, every time. The mastery mindset. Becoming a lifelong student of human connection. In 1993, psychologist K. Anders Ericsson published research that would eventually reshape how the world thinks about the development of expertise. His finding that elite performers in virtually every domain achieve their level through approximately 10,000 hours of deliberate, focused practice rather than through innate talent became one of the most cited and discussed ideas in modern behavioral science. What most people missed in the subsequent popular conversation about Ericsson's research is the word that matters most: deliberate. Not 10,000 hours of doing something. 10,000 hours of specific, intentional practice focused on the precise aspects of performance that need improvement, with structured feedback about what's working and what isn't. Most people who communicate for decades never reach mastery, not because they lack time or intelligence, but because they repeat the same comfortable patterns over and over rather than deliberately expanding their capabilities into the territory where real growth happens. Communication mastery requires a fundamentally different relationship with your own performance. It requires treating every interaction as information, every difficulty as a specific diagnostic, every success as something to understand and replicate deliberately rather than attribute to luck. This is the mastery mindset. And here is how to build it. Element 1. Become a pattern reader. The most advanced communication skill is not a technique, it is the ability to read human dynamics, to notice what's actually happening in a conversation beneath the surface content, to recognize patterns of behavior, to predict likely responses, and to calibrate your approach accordingly in real time. Pattern reading develops through a particular quality of attention that most people never cultivate: the habit of observing interactions with genuine analytical curiosity rather than just participating in them. Start noticing. What happens in a meeting when the most senior person speaks first versus when they hold back? How does the same message land differently when delivered with energy versus when delivered with calm? What patterns do you notice in the people who consistently move others, and what do those patterns have in common? This observational habit practiced consistently, builds a kind of social intelligence that no book and no training program can fully provide. It comes from watching, questioning, and refining your understanding of how human beings actually behave with each other in all their wonderful, frustrating, surprising complexity. Element 2. Seek feedback. That actually stings. Most feedback loops in professional life are designed to produce comfort, not growth. Performance reviews focus on the past and tend toward the diplomatic. Colleagues offer encouragement because they care about you and don't want to seem critical. Managers soften hard truths to maintain relationships. The result is a constant diet of mildly positive, vaguely useful feedback that tells you almost nothing about what you actually need to change. Seek the feedback that's harder to hear. Ask the trusted colleague who will be honest at the cost of your momentary comfort. Ask the client whose expectations you didn't fully meet. Ask the audience member who seemed unconvinced during your presentation. The question to ask is not, "How did I do?" It's, "What would have made this more effective?" That reframe takes the conversation from social evaluation to genuine learning and produces dramatically more useful information. Element 3. Study the masters. Across disciplines, the most powerful communication insights come not from communication training alone, but from understanding human psychology across the full range of contexts in which influence operates. Study how great therapists create the conditions for honest conversation. Study how skilled negotiators manage tension and identify common ground. Study how the best trial attorneys build credibility with juries through the precise management of tone, pacing, and evidence sequencing. Study how great teachers create the conditions under which difficult ideas become accessible. These disciplines share a common substrate, an understanding of how human beings process information, make decisions, form trust, and change their minds. The principles that make a therapist effective in a clinical setting and the principles that make a negotiator effective in a boardroom are more similar than they are different. Draw connections, abstract principles, apply them across contexts. The communicator who learns from the widest range of domains builds a toolkit of unusual versatility and power. Element 4. Practice deliberately in low-stakes situations. Every difficult skill requires a practice environment where the cost of failure is low enough to tolerate repetition. Most people practice their most important communication skills in their most important conversations, which is the equivalent of practicing surgery on actual patients. The stakes are too high, the feedback too immediate, and the emotional investment too great for genuine learning to happen efficiently. Build deliberate practice environments. Join a public speaking group and use it to experiment with techniques you'd be too cautious to try in a client meeting. Role-play difficult conversations with trusted colleagues before having them with actual stakeholders. Practice your influence techniques in low-stakes social situations where a failed experiment costs nothing. The goal is to expand your comfort zone in controlled environments so that the expanded capability becomes available in real high-stakes situations. You're not practicing to perform. You're practicing to grow the range of what feels natural. Element 5. Teach what you know. Teaching is the most demanding test of understanding available. When you explain something to someone else, genuinely explain it in a way that actually helps them understand and use it, you discover with remarkable efficiency exactly where your own understanding is solid and where it has gaps you hadn't recognized. Every time you help a colleague navigate a difficult conversation, you learn something about difficult conversations. Every time you coach a younger professional on how to communicate with authority, you refine your own understanding of what authority actually requires. Every time you articulate a principle you've been operating on intuitively, you deepen your conscious command of it. Teach everywhere you can. Mentor formally and informally. Share frameworks that have been useful to you. Be generous with what you've learned. The knowledge compounds in you as it spreads outward, and the reputation it builds for you is one of the most durable and valuable forms of professional capital available. Your communication revolution. Starting now, everything in this book leads to a single point, not a technique, not a principle, a choice. The choice is whether you will treat communication as something that happens to you, a collection of conversations you navigate as best you can with whatever instincts you've developed, or as something you actively, deliberately, systematically build. Most people make the first choice by default, not because they don't care about communication, but because nobody has ever shown them that the second choice is available, that there is a body of knowledge, a set of learnable principles, a systematic approach to developing communication capability that can genuinely transform how people perceive you, how you navigate the most important conversations of your life, and what you're able to build and achieve as a result. That second choice is what this book has been about, and the only question left is whether you make it. The implementation imperative knowledge? Without implementation is just entertainment. You may have found the ideas in this book interesting or useful, or even genuinely exciting. But interesting ideas that don't change behavior don't change anything. The person you are in your most important conversations next month will be determined not by what you've read, but by what you've practiced. Begin immediately, not when you feel ready, not when the right situation presents itself. Immediately. Your next conversation, however ordinary, is a practice opportunity. Your next email is a chance to lead with clarity rather than hedging. Your next difficult interaction is a chance to regulate before you respond. The gap between knowing and doing is where most self-improvement fails. The only way across that gap is through deliberate, consistent, imperfect application of what you've learned until the new patterns become your default. The honest assessment. Before you begin the implementation process, do something most people resist. Be genuinely honest about where you are. Not harshly, not defensively, honestly. Which of the 7 silent killers from Chapter 1 show up most reliably in your communication? Where do your first impressions consistently underperform your actual capability? In which situations does your confidence falter most predictably? Which difficult conversations have you been avoiding, and what is that avoidance actually costing you? This honest inventory is not an exercise in self-criticism. It is the starting point for targeted improvement. The communicator who knows specifically what needs to change improves 10 times faster than the one who is vaguely committed to being a better communicator. Be specific, be honest, be kind to yourself in the process, but don't let kindness shade into dishonesty about what's actually true. The compound effect of daily practice communication mastery is not achieved in a weekend intensive or a single breakthrough conversation. It is built through thousands of small, deliberate improvements applied consistently over months and years. The math of this is more encouraging than most people realize. A 1% improvement in your communication effectiveness, compounded daily over a single year, produces a communicator who is 37 times more effective than the one who started. Not 37% better, 37 times. This is not hyperbole. It is the literal mathematics of compound growth applied to skill development. Small, consistent improvements in the right areas produce outcomes that would seem impossible from the starting point because exponential curves look flat until they don't. The daily practice doesn't need to be formal or intensive. It needs to be intentional. One conversation per day where you deliberately apply a principle you've been developing. One email per week, written with the kind of care you'd bring to your most important communication. One difficult conversation per month that you initiate rather than avoid. Small decisions, massive compound return. The identity shift. Here is the final and most important thing I want to tell you. The goal of everything in this book is not ultimately to make you better at communication techniques. Techniques are means, not ends. The goal is an identity shift, the transition from someone who sometimes communicates well to someone who is, at their core, a powerful communicator. This shift happens when the principles in this book stop being things you try to remember and become things you simply are. When emotional regulation isn't a technique you deploy, but a quality you've genuinely developed. When purposeful listening isn't something you practice, but something that comes naturally because you've genuinely become curious about other people. When confident presence isn't something you perform, but something you inhabit because you've done the work to know who you are and what you bring. This is not a distant aspiration. It is the predictable result of systematic practice applied over time. Every person who has become a genuinely powerful communicator went through exactly this process, not as a uniquely talented individual who somehow had access to knowledge others didn't, but as a person who decided to take communication seriously and then put in the work that decision required. You now have the knowledge. The work is yours. Your communication revolution starts with your very next conversation, not someday, now. The only question is how seriously you'll take what happens next.